I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. In this January 19th, 2018 episode of the Poetry of Predicament, we're welcoming Margaret Klein Salamon. Whether you're connecting with her website, theclimatepsychologist.com, or her team's website, theclimatemobilization.org, or if you're lucky enough to have bumped into her writing, an example of which is The Transformative Power of Climate Truth. Well, Margaret Klein Salamon is easily one of the most powerful writers and powerful presences on the environmental movement stage today. Stay tuned for a strong and spicy interview with Margaret Klein Salamon. Margaret, my name's Dean. I'm Dean Walker, and it's a pleasure to meet you. And I don't know how well I conveyed my motivation, my desire to, do this interview with you, that I just have been following your writing and really moved by it, and moved by so much of what you say directly, but also through the organization, the mobilization. I've really been in search of people who have some capacity to address what I call the sober data of our world. And you and your team just seem to be some of the few people out there who are conversant, who are willing to.
Yeah, well, thank you. And it's always, it's such a crazy time that we're living in. And there's this feeling, this, jolt of recognition and fellowship when you meet someone who is, as to use the language from one of my papers, who is living in climate truth. Right. Who is not, the vast majority of Americans and just people are living in a fantasy world where they're doing things like planning for decades into the future about their careers or their family or their, whatever, their goals.
Yeah.
And I've got some bad news. But when, it is just, and it's so alienating to live in a world where most people, vast majority of people, are just like on a different planet. Their planet isn't having an ecological crisis and the sixth mass extinction of species. It's just fine, apparently. So anyway, meeting people who share that kind of understanding, it's so important.
Yeah, it is. What I'd really like to do, can I just tell you a little bit about what Carolyn Baker and I are doing and what we're about?
Sure.
Okay, so I don't know if you're familiar with Carolyn's work. Are you? Have you
a
heard?
Little.
Yeah, she's, I think, the most prolific author regarding being collapse aware in terms of collapse of human or Earth systems, and really addressing the question, who will we be together in the face of it? And I've just had the privilege of connecting up with her about 3 years ago, as I was really grappling with having to vet the information of abrupt climate change and a number of other metrics that I find even more disturbing. And because of her incredible depth of experience with it, and I come from a background of doing corporate and personal development training for years and years, we just found a way to start to conspire. What if we could create some powerful ways of getting tools and expansion of capacity into people's experience, if that's what they're after? And so we've been doing that little by little, just trying to grow it out. And last year was our first couple of live 3-day workshops. And this year will be a couple more of those, and really this is the beginning of the unfolding of the online offerings that we're going to do. And yeah, and so I think we're on a very similar wavelength to y'all.
But can I ask you, what is the goal? Is it to kind of flourish in a collapsing world, or is it to prevent the collapse?
I don't know that either of us would just throw out the opportunity to engage in important ways. You know, we're both pretty close with a guy named Andrew Harvey, who talks a lot about sacred activism. So activism that is that comes from a sobriety and a connection with one's core. And I'm sure it's nothing new to you. I don't mean to be, speaking to you like you don't know about that stuff. But really, I think we're both pretty clear that the vast majority of the tipping points have already been passed. The easier off ramps from this particular freeway we've passed long ago. And the best that we're hoping for is to bring people to full presence in their own life, to be able to break open their hearts in the most beautiful way they can, and to find what is their expression, what's the best way for them to express in their own lives. And more often than not, we've been seeing that it's such a natural expression for people to want to be involved and activist in their lives. But ours is not a let's go out and fix this thing. It's really an expansion of capacity, an expansion of an inner toolkit for thriving in the midst of it.
Yeah, I mean, I have such a mixed reaction because I very strongly agree that kind of the kind of supported self-exploration that you're talking about is important for people. I mean, just what we're facing is so overwhelming. It's basically people can't be expected to cope with it alone. But I feel that we have a moral duty to do everything we can to prevent the collapse of civilization and the natural world. And so the idea of like Earth in hospice, for example, which is the one I'm familiar with, or just kind of I know that you have involvement with, near-term human extinction, those kinds of communities. I feel that the defeat and resignation expressed is, I feel very uncomfortable with it. And I because the way I see it, climate change, science works by repeated hypothesis testing, and the climate crisis this is new, and we are learning about what happens to our planet when we pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And so while obviously I agree that the situation is terribly dire, and I'm not a scientist, whether we've hit tipping points, which ones, whatever, I cannot speak to. But it's like, the way I look at it is, what % chance does humanity have of coming out of this alive, without the deaths of billions of people, without utter catastrophe? Maybe it's less than 1%, right? Maybe I don't know. Maybe you could say it's 0.1%. I don't know. I don't know that either, but I know that whatever that is, that is what we should be focused on.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I feel, yeah, I think that we need to pair a realistic understanding of the crisis with basically it's the idea of taking responsibility. And it's kind of an absurd idea because the climate crisis is so much bigger than all of us, but that's what the Climate Mobilization is as an organization. It's a group of people who've said, okay, it's going to be my responsibility to solve this crisis, and I'm going to put in everything I've got. And that doesn't guarantee victory, but I think it's the right thing to do.
Sure.
And obviously it makes without that kind of effort, then catastrophe is assured.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
not sure if I might be hearing kind of a background implication or assumption in what you're saying that's what we're about. Perhaps you've checked out our website or whatever, and I'm
not in depth.
Go ahead.
Not in depth, I'm afraid, but
okay.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty safe to say that what I've read that you all have put out and videos I've watched and so on, I'm extraordinarily aligned with everything that you're about. And what I know, having fairly recently started working and producing some stuff for the near-term human extinction support group on Facebook, I find them to be remarkably active and hopeful and not very skilled group of people in terms of being able to establish some kind of baseline of resilience in themselves. So that's, Carolyn and I are both kind of new to the group and new to offering the kind of skill set building that we're about to these folks, because I think they really are on a very similar wavelength to what you were just describing. So it might be kind of surprising because their name is, extremely off-putting, and I understand how that can be like, what the heck, like, why am I even talking to these people? But I think you might be surprised at the amount of care and activism and engagement at a community level and so on that you'd find in these groups that are just perhaps awkward in how they present themselves, how they name themselves and so on. But I think they're pretty engaged.
Yeah, I can empathize with the idea that there is no hope. I mean, it's such a horrifying and overwhelming situation. But yeah, I just I just worry about messaging that implies that the goal should be personal rather than collective empowerment. But anyway, we don't have to dwell on my reservations. I just wanted to note them.
Sure, duly noted, and thanks. Yeah. Well, if I could, just in typical interview fashion, if I could just ask you to describe for us just a little bit about what got you to this place where, primarily I think we're talking about the Climate Mobilization, the organization that you are central in. And I'd also love to hear about what has culminated in the extraordinary writings that I've read from you and your team. That again, I find the sober clarity of them entirely refreshing, because I have a very low tolerance for the misrepresentation and understatement that seems to be rampant in so many organizations that are, supposedly aimed at the same stuff. So I'd just love it if you'd introduce yourself to us a little bit and tell us about what got you to this place.
Great. Yeah, so uh, I'm Margaret Klein Salamon. I grew up, my family was, my father's a psychoanalyst, and my mom was, for a time, studying clinical psychology, but became a kindergarten teacher. But so from my whole life, I've been in this psychological kind of mentality. And I studied social anthropology at Harvard for undergraduate, which is the same kind of thinking, but looking at groups. I mean, just looking very closely at why people do what they do and what are the meanings involved and what are the motivations and relationships. And then I went for my PhD in clinical psychology, psychoanalytic clinical psychology, at Adelphi, University of New York. And during that training, during that PhD, I started to get more and more alarmed by the climate crisis. And that's partially from living in New York through hurricanes Irene and Sandy. But I think primarily through just my own process of maturation, personal development, my own, with which my own psychotherapy was extremely helpful with, and kind of gaining the inner strength to lower my defenses, such as my primary defense was willful ignorance. I think that's a primary defense in general for the climate crisis, especially among like educated Americans who, so I knew that enough to know that this was very frightening. And I would do things like read the first line of an article and quickly exit out and just say, consciously say, I can't do it. But so I got stronger. I think my capacity to tolerate painful feelings such as fear, despair, strengthened. And I started to actually come to terms with. I mean, I started to actually read those articles and actually get a sense for what was happening in the climate. And I confirmed my worst suspicions. This is very, very, this is an acute crisis. We're both in danger. Everyone's in danger. And so I started to think about how I could change my life to incorporate this reality. And I was thinking that I would start a blog and kind of see patients in the morning, write in the afternoon, something like that. When a very good friend of mine, very politically savvy friend, said to me, I wanted to consult him on this blog. And he said to me, don't start a blog. Discourse isn't enough. Think, what could you do that could actually solve this problem? And that challenge, what could you do that could actually solve this problem? It literally changed my entire life. And there's no turning back, because once I had conceptualized myself as, once I had conceptualized that as my kind of goal, my personal mission, whatever, I realized there's nothing that I want a fraction of as much. And so I did start a blog, actually, The Climate Psychologist, but it was always with the intention of starting an organization, finding allies in this, and I did. Ezra Silk, and then who wrote the Victory Plan, and then just a huge network of internationally and now at home. And the Climate Mobilization is an organization that is based in truth. I mean, I'm a clinical psychologist. That's what I bring to this, like an ability to not get swept into these fantasies and kind of defensive ideas about that I see virtually all climate organizations trying to do, in order they try to twist the data to fit their advocacy rather than the other way around. So we are founded and operate on the principles of telling the truth, and advocating for what is actually necessary to solve the climate crisis. So we are dedicated to making the necessary possible. And what is very obvious, if you understand the climate crisis at all, is what is necessary is for us to eliminate, not reduce, eliminate greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as humanly possible in 10 years or less, and to draw down excess CO2 and greenhouse gases from our atmosphere until we have returned to Holocene conditions, approximately 280 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. That any idea that we should decarbonize gradually over decades is not grounded in reality or morality. I mean, I find it deeply troubling that this is still what the green NGOs, including 350, Greenpeace, Sierra Club, what they're all talking about is multi-decade transitions to either zero emissions or, even worse, sometimes just 100% renewables, which fails to take into account other emission sources. So our our like tagline on the website is we advocate for the strongest, fastest, sanest climate plan out there. Fight for the strongest, fastest, sanest, and that's I mean, that's true. We use World War II as a metaphor to show. I mean, or actually, it's more than a metaphor. It's an example of what the United States was able to accomplish when we snapped out of our denial, years of isolationism, to realize that this was not a choice whether to enter this war. We had to, and the option was to win or lose, or I should say, win or perish. And when society kind of snapped into that awareness, we were able to accomplish absolutely tremendous things. I mean, absolutely, like we were able to accomplish far beyond what anyone thought was possible. And we should expect with the climate crisis that if we achieve that level of dedication as a society, that there will be breakthroughs in every field, as there were during World War II, that production, I mean, just like we're a brilliant species. We've done amazing things, and country, the ingenuity and innovation and, a can-do attitude, that stuff is real. And but right now it's devoted to, making iPhone apps and advertising. I mean, these priorities that are very much not solving the climate crisis. So if we redirect human potential of our country, of our various industries, and of our population towards solving the crisis, I mean, that's just the only way it's going to get done.
If I could just pause you for a second, I
Sure.
absolutely am on. I'm on a very similar wavelength with everything you're sharing, and I'm just curious about a particular element. I just put out my first book last year, and I'm not a natural writer at all. So it was something, a couple of years of really hard work. And one of the hardest pieces of that work was to look at pretty much at the center of what you've just been sharing. So what will it take? make the necessary possible. I love that. I love that phrase. And to me, the title of my book is The Impossible Conversation. And what I meant by the impossible conversation was, after about 25 years in business consulting, and leading trainings for executives and so on, it looked to me like at the center of what it would take to truly address these extraordinary circumstances we have going on, that nothing short of slowing down and, in a number of instances, stopping aspects of our human operating system is called for. So from my point of view, it's just a slight variant, I think, and I'm just curious how you might react to it. In addition to the things that you're saying, which my hat is off to what you're saying. It's very, very clear and good. And I'm wondering, how does that fit in your model as well, or in your thinking of you and your team as you look at what is necessary? Is a part of what is necessary somehow slowing down, or in some instances stopping aspects of what we're doing?
Absolutely, but I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but obviously we need to stop burning fossil fuels, factory farming of animals, and constantly stimulating people's desire to consume material goods by advertising would be some examples. That's the kind of stuff you're talking about?
Pretty much. I mean, we could take any one of those, and for instance, the one that has always been like a little gnat in the conversation that never seems to go away is, just in the USA, we are so used to having everything delivered to our neighborhoods, to our stores, to everything by diesel trucks, and they are the lifeblood of getting everything everywhere in this country. And just to look at that, and at the moment, there is no replacement for diesel. There is no alternative fuel. There's no alternative arrangement. So what do you do?
Right. So, I mean, Tesla just did a electric semi, right? I mean,
yeah, it's coming right along, sure.
But right, it's not available now. I mean, yeah. So I don't know the answer for trucks, but I know how we should approach the question, which is understanding that the current system is suicidal, and it must stop. And so, and then figuring out, so what are we going to do? Right. Like what is, I mean, we need to feed everybody. So how, but we don't necessarily need to get everybody, sneakers. So just thinking about, how to answer that problem, probably some combination of using trains and electric vehicles and significant reduction in the level of shipping that's going on.
Yeah.
Total. I mean, I don't think it is, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but it is not incumbent on me or on anyone to know how we're going to do this, in order to passionately believe and be confident in the fact that we must do it.
I'm with you, and I'm sorry if I was putting anything like that into your corner with that. It was just literally it just rang for me when you were sharing, which again, I'm completely on the same page with what you've laid out, and that last commitment that you just expressed again so clearly. I'm with you. And I was just meaning to share with you one of the kind of annoying gnats that whenever it crossed my screen, it's like, Jesus, that's just so, it makes my head explode, is really what it meant to be by sharing it. Not at all.
Yeah, no, certainly you're fine. But one thing I will add to that is I am quite convinced that a key feature of the transition we need to make is local food, gardens, victory gardens. During World War II, 40% of vegetables were grown at home. And I think we could do a lot better than that. I mean, that just like there's, I mean, for, and this is really for, there's several reasons. One is shipping, right? That's very important. Another is food security,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, we are headed into some scary agricultural conditions.
Absolutely.
And the extent to which people can grow their own food is going to be a huge, of huge importance. But then also, you know, I mean, community building and using the gardens as carbon sinks to, you know, for compost. I mean, it's like one of these things that just, I mean, it's kind of has its own tipping point, or, you know, positive feedback loop, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of what it kicks off. But it creates in the climate actually a negative feedback loop in terms of reducing emissions. Or this is I'm I'm sorry. This is I let's leave that technical
Sure.
confusion behind.
Sure.
So yeah, I think the key thing is understanding excuse me, again, is understanding that the path that our society is currently on leads like exactly nowhere. It is collective suicide, and if you understand that, if you really accept that intellectually and excuse me, as like a part of your self, then it becomes much easier to imagine and accept a different world that will be harder in some ways and will be better in some ways.
Yeah. I think again we're on amazingly similar tracks at the center of your conversation and mine. I'm very curious what your experience, you and your team, as you keep putting the word out, and I'm assuming that you're getting some amount of growth, meaning other people signing up and joining with the mobilization and really getting it. Can you talk about how that's going and what some of the other than positive reactions you get? I mean, how's it going in terms of people just saying, "Yeah, I'm so thankful to have found you. I'm literally thankful to have found you and your team. It has been so refreshing." The kind of output that you all do, your papers and so on, they're so good. Am I alone, or I can't imagine you must have some kind of numbers stacking up of people who are like me wanting that message?
Yeah, so is an interesting question. What we have as an organization, our key strength is the level of dedication and passion of our volunteers. We're virtually volunteer-run organization. Our budget is like, this year it's going to be like $100,000, which, you know, while better than nothing, is just a fraction of what traditional environmental organizations, like a very small fraction of what, I mean, big green organizations have multi-million-dollar budgets annually. So, but why? And I would love to remedy that, and I'm working on it. But But the reason we are able to succeed despite being so low resource is because there are people, not a huge amount of people, but a handful, who say, this is it. This is what I want to do. I did that in starting the organization, but a lot of people have joined in that spirit as well. So we have very, very talented people who are volunteering like more than 20 hours a week, sometimes more than 60 hours a week. And so, yeah, that to me, that group of people who, or that category of person who says, the climate crisis is, basically I'm going to take responsibility for solving this, and put kind of whatever it takes kind of mentality, or another kind of catchphrase we've used is going all in for all life. Mm-hmm. And so that is really our base or our team. And we do have some supporters. It's really hard to quantify. I mean, our email list is like 12,000, but that's, a very low level of engagement. Some people on that list, if you ask them who is the Climate Mobilization, they wouldn't really even know. And we probably have, I don't know, let's say approximately 30 people who are currently actively engaged, maybe more, but in volunteering or in local organizing, which is our key programming right now. It's called City by City. After the election, we pivoted to local organizing. And after spending the election trying to intervene in the process, and we had some successes. We got Bernie Sanders advocating for World War II scale climate mobilization, and then we got that language into the Democratic Party platform, which we were going to use as a kind of jumping off point for our plan was to like pressure the Clinton administration into making good on the promises in the Democratic Party platform. But instead, we had to reevaluate, refocus. And so we were doing this local organizing. And we've got some successes there as well, such as Hoboken, New Jersey, declared a climate emergency and committed to eliminating emissions by 2027. Montgomery County in Maryland, with more than 1 million people, declared a climate emergency and committed to eliminating emissions by 2035. And just yesterday in Los Angeles, 2 city council people introduced a motion to create a climate emergency mobilization department that would oversee the emergency speed decarbonization of Los Angeles. And their goal year is also 2025. Those kinds of organizing wins are possible because of volunteer organizers who take this on. So anyway, that's the people who I'm like really care about and want to grow, is that group of people, like on climate surveys and stuff in like Yale's 6 Americas, they always say, are you not concerned, a little concerned, very concerned, or whatever, very or alarmed. And I always want there to be like another category of like, I'm so alarmed that I'm refocusing my life on this, or I'm so alarmed that I'm making huge personal transformation. So so that's who makes up the group. In terms of reactions otherwise, like from the public or from like, it's amazing. Honestly, it's amazing how positive people's reactions are. I mean, the climate situation is just so weird. It's just so like there's the disconnect between like the truth that is every year making itself more obviously apparent to everyone, and the discourse is so divorced from each other. That so like the resolutions in front of the Hoboken City Council and the Montgomery County Council to declare climate emergency and commit to these extremely ambitious zero emissions goals, they both passed unanimously. And getting on the Democratic Party platform, that getting our language on that amendment, the person who we were working with was advised not to introduce it. Why? Because the Sanders campaign didn't think that it was going to pass. And it did pass. It passed overwhelmingly. And my kind of takeaway from that, those kind of like unexpected successes, let's say, or they're more successful than we expect, is that nobody wants this, right? Nobody wants, or I mean, maybe some people who are so internally hurting and damaged that they think, okay, maybe it's better for the whole ship to go down or something. But but basically, people would prefer to not have civilization collapse and, you know, half the world in famine and millions of refugees, right? Like that's people don't want that. And but when you give them something to do, right? Here, pass this, do this, we can solve the climate crisis. Of course they want it. Of course it's popular. It's just getting through all these layers of, oh, it's not possible, be realistic.
It's really not an issue.
Yeah, it's just, let's just stick with carbon pricing.
Yeah,
you know,
right.
That's I mean, like, so I think, I think there's I think it is a sad shame that the climate movement has forgotten that by far our strongest asset strategically is the truth.
Yeah.
And that, like, that if you treat telling the truth like it's kind of optional or like not very important, then you lose that your biggest strategic asset.
Yeah. You know, it's reminding me of again, kind of midstream when I was putting together my expression of this path, the book, The Impossible Conversation. I at one point I was really directed. It just seemed time and again I was supposed to read some books on the neuroscience that's so at play and that's obviously so ubiquitous. That now thousands of books about how the brain works and how we process and how you can't possibly communicate like this about important issues in our world. You always have to do this or that and so on. And I got to tell you that it's just, it was deeply, deeply discouraging to me. One of the toughest hurdles to get over for me, for my just own kind of discouragement was that so very few, like after reading roughly 20 books on the subject, were only two that made any mention whatsoever of the multi-billion-dollar industry of denial that's been, pumping into us as a culture for decades. And to not include that as a part of the equation, this barely formed piece of an equation that we're trying so hard to formulate about how do we process and how do we communicate with each other about important issues. And I just found it so deeply discouraging that these very talented, clearly very talented scientists doing this great research about brain processing, and yet we were not talking about the the dead buffalo in the center of the room of how we have so stripped away the spine of the, like you're saying about the truth, that what's the truth of what's going on, and how on earth did we let denial become a thing?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. The fossil fuel industry has been very, very successful with their misinformation campaign, and they have achieved not only sowing doubt in a significant portion of the population, they've also made it so much harder to discuss socially. They've made it a controversial topic, politics, that so rather than feeling like, of course, this is a shared goal, that who would be against saving our world, it's you're kind of in a political camp by recognizing the scale of the crisis, and I think similarly people feel, and this is co-created by the fossil fuel industry, but then also by the reaction to it from the climate movement and from climate scientists and so on. But there's I think that this blocked my involvement for many years during college, for example, that a feeling that the climate crisis is a science issue and it should be handled by experts, and you're going to have to master a body of knowledge, a technical body of knowledge, before you can communicate with confidence about the climate crisis. I mean, I have never been terribly interested in math or science. And so the idea to, learn about the atmosphere and all of these complicated processes, I just was not interesting. But and I know that people can be deterred from engaging because they feel similarly, and they feel that they'll be asked difficult questions that they won't know how to answer, such as, and this is again with these kind of denier theories that have been propelled by the fossil fuel industry. Things like, well, what about sunspots, or the pause in warming, or and I mean, it would take a PhD to be able to debunk all of those theories. But I encourage people to say, I don't know the answer to your question, but I do know that the existence of human-induced climate change is a scientific consensus. We've known that carbon was a greenhouse gas since the 1800s. And you should just be aware that there's been a multi-billion-dollar effort from the richest industry in the world to convince you of the points that you're making. And they're playing you. So I think it's important to realize, though, that while the climate crisis was brought to our attention by scientists, and obviously scientists can be very helpful in understanding it in different ways and understanding mitigation in different ways, it is not a science issue. I mean, any phenomenon can be described and understood through a scientific lens. It's an everything issue. It's a food issue, and a water issue, and a refugee issue, and a survival issue, a moral issue. I mean, it's and I guess what I'm trying to say is it's your issue, whoever you are.
Yeah. I'm just so curious. You clearly have a committed and downright brilliant team going on, and yet I know that you all are right on the front line of doing the heavy lifting by bringing us the quality of truth that you bring us. I'm curious if you have any collective and or individual practices that you have in place to keep yourselves connected and open-hearted and sane?
That's an interesting question. I think I think and hope that as a leader, I set the tone and culture of both like self-acceptance combined with passionate dedication. I mean, that's clearly the defining thing about the culture of the organization is the work. I mean, like the orientation towards, I mean, people, we just work so hard. But which one would do if they felt that their work could potentially avert the collapse of civilization?
Yes.
And so I think, yeah, honesty in communication and level of dedication are the main things. I mean, we try. I like Joanna Macy. I like that book, Active Hope.
Yeah.
So we try to practice gratitude, particularly, and the gratitude to each other, and particularly the gratitude of being able to take part in such an effort.
Yeah.
I know different people do meditation and intense workouts.
Sure.
I think working out is actually a really important thing for people doing this work because it can get your mind off it in a way that can be rare.
Yeah.
Because I do think it's important to sometimes not think about the climate crisis. Most of the time, think about it and work on it, but sometimes take a break.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the buzzwords in Carolyn's and my world right now is as we're putting together the kind of the foundation stones of our body of work is just radical self-care. Because this guy, I don't know if you're familiar with Andrew Harvey, but again, one of his main thrusts in his body of work is about sacred activism, and he comes from a long history of being an extraordinary scholar in all sorts of religious and spiritual traditions. And he has a quote from one of his main books about that, in which the quote goes something like, if you're planning on engaging in the world in this sacred activism, in this way of wanting to make a difference in the world from this spiritual center, then to approach that work without practices, without spiritually empowering practices, is like running into a forest fire wearing only a paper tutu. And I've certainly found that to be true. And working out and having a meditation practice and on down the list, you bet.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're coming up on the end of our time, and I know that you have a forever full plate, and I so appreciate you taking the time to speak with me here, and I look forward to polishing this little episode up and getting it onto all the different podcasts that I have access to. I'm happy to get a link to you if it's of any use whatsoever, and
sure.
Please know that we will continue to talk up the climate mobilization and your fine work, and as perhaps one of the top options that someone who's newly cracked open to participating in sacred activism, I can't imagine a better place for them to be spending their time and energy.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I know, that it definitely seems like a good recruiting population. I do just want to mention this year, one of my goals is to create a base of monthly giving for the climate mobilization so we can have a bit more financial security. So in order to try and develop that, we have unrolled the Mobilizer Backer program. Mobilizer Backers are monthly givers at $30 a month or $5 for low income people.
Yep.
And what we're offering with that beyond just, supporting a worthwhile organization, very worthwhile, but is I'm doing a call every month on, it's called Life in the Climate Crisis. Mm-hmm. So it's about, it's going to evolve. It's kind of a work in progress, but it's people call in and talk about things we've talked about and just what it's like to hold this knowledge and to live in the world. And generally people have had extremely positive experiences with that kind of group sharing. And then another monthly call, which is about just what the climate mobilization is doing, updates, discussion of kind of strategic questions, and taking questions and feedback. So if you are interested in supporting this work, but without necessarily going all in, I think it's a really important, it's very helpful to us. So I would ask people to consider engaging that way.
Very good. Well, we'll be sure to have the climatemobilization.org information on the screen for those who are watching this in video. And of course, I've just said it for those who are just listening to it. And I hope you'll pass on from our tiny team to your slightly larger team our deep appreciation for the work that you all are doing. And again, the very heavy lifting that I think y'all are doing, and certainly we attempt to do as well, to address the situation that we're all in, the predicament they're all in perhaps, with as much truth as possible, but also with hearts intentionally and beautifully broken open.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for your work as well.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Margaret Klein Salamon. Hope you have a wonderful, I guess it's going to be evening for you soon.
Yep.
And thank you again for taking time with us.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. You may want to check out our sister podcasts, the New Lifeboat Hour with Carolyn Baker on Podbean and at carolynbaker.net. Also, the Impossible Conversation podcast, another channel on YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us. Join us again later for another episode of the Poetry of Predicament.